In my head, you have held me in your arms. In my head, I've been witness to your charms 1,000 times. You have sung me a love song in my head.
Hello, welcome to Acts of Commission and the second part of the special edition of the Attic Sessions, which is a North-South collaboration by invitation of Belfast-based Quotidian Word on the Street. And in part two, we're joined by poet Sinead Morrissey, who was commissioned to write a new poem, What Pa Saw at the Benders. Sinead was born in Portadown in County Armagh. She's published 6 collections of poetry, the most recent being On Balance in 2017. 3 of her first 4 collections were shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize, and she went on to win it for her collection Parallax. And in 2016, she was appointed Professor of Creative Writing at the University of Newcastle, and she lives in Northumberland with her family. And our next guest on Acts of Commission is Sinead Morrissey. And Sinead's going to read her poem, What Pa Saw at the Benders.
What Pa Saw at the Benders. The inverse of the prairie, an endless monotonous play with brief intermissions of cacophonous hail. The Benders' one-room emporium, perched on the Osage Trail like a mark of redemption, promises everything. Overnighting, simple suppers, dry goods, hardware. The sharp rap of the dead's knuckles on the pine wood floor, should the interior have eaten your people 2 decades before on the great unravelling west, and you smoulder to speak to them. Here's Kate in a ferrotype photograph, holding her nerves erect. Yes, she says, I, Absalom Harding, counted 96 bone heaps of oxen. It was difficult to find a camping ground destitute of carcasses. But now there is grace abounding, and you too will be welcome. All Pa wants is to water the horses. The girls and Ma stay in the wagon. There are flies. The canvas expands in the heat, bright as curvature rigging. Mary watches a sugar-spun lattice of light settle on whatever she looks at, a dishpan, a rain, a bonnet, and knows it's the future. And if we never get quite as far as the greeny Pacific, but repeat like a hide-bound shuttlecock our teetering rut-worn swales and switherings, Wisconsin, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, that's fine with me, thinks Ma, whose recurring dream of abandoned things, clocks, bellows, diving bells, a linear junkyard of jettisoned excess all the way to the sea, harries her nightly. Notes on the white plates of buffalo skulls from friends in the forward train's makeshift graves and epitaphs. If you held up your hand to the sunset, thinks Ma, you'd still feel the shame and blister of it. I must remember, chants Laura, knocking her boots together. Sweat trickles unstintingly from her armpits, making her scratch. And if there is destiny, manifest on a palm or at the end of a terrible plain or in a smiling enticement to rest, sit down, eat beside a mysterious curtain, there is also its opposite, the toothed wheel's failure to catch, the persistent grit of the ordinary in the exceptional day that sees Pa tipping his hat to the lady and walking back to where his womenfolk wait by the track, and if the murdered delivered into birds packed dense as counsellors about the dusty homestead swivel their necks to follow him, he can't say he notices. unfasten my soul, sings Kate in the box church in Harmony Grove, practically accentless, for whom the soul is a calico shirt on a line in drying weather, swinging to be free. Haloed in rhyme and meandering, her famed second sights a whimsy of pickings and choosings, showing neither the verdigris river nor what will be done to her next, the rope, the pain, the flame, nor her garden giving up the ghost of its deciduous secrets at last, like her very self undressing. A dozen buckled heresies exhumed for proper burial. But a gentleman caller, hazed in the tint of sepia, who stands in the shadow of her porch regarding her sadly. Her name, her spine, her art, her crossing of decorum's vertiginous boundary, its promiscuous kiss.
Superb, extraordinary poetry, but also beautifully read as ever, Sinead. And slightly traumatizing, because as part of a generation who grew up watching Little House on the Prairie, my grandmother's favourite programme, it's a bit startling to discover the Ingalls family in the same poem as some notorious serial killers.
Yes.
So how did you conceive of bringing these two disparate groups together?
Yeah, well, I read Little House on the Prairie. I read that series as a child. I was completely fascinated by it. But the poem actually started somewhere else. So the poem started in a National Geographic that I came across in a youth hostel about 15 years ago. And it was the story of, the wagon trail to the Pacific around, the middle of the 19th century. And what I hadn't understood about that exodus was how calamitous it was, how dangerous it was, how many people died en route. So there were like letters from survivors, and there were these graphic descriptions of the kind of difficulties and the cholera and the the trauma of that. And I thought, I kind of read it and I thought, there's a poem in that. But, I didn't know what the poem was or how that was going to happen, but I had it kind of parked in my mind. And then I found out about this kind of surprising coincidence in the Ingalls family that Pa had called at the house of kind of the first white serial killers of settled America, the Benders, and that nothing had happened. And so I those two things came together in my mind. And what I was really fascinated by was that, nothing happened. That was kind of the crux of it for me. Whether it's even true or not, I don't know. But Laura Ingalls Wilder said that had happened, and then was told to take that out of the Little House on the Prairie book series because it was considered, too disturbing and too traumatic. In lots of ways, I think the Little House on the Prairie books are full of, the violence of the Native Americans against the white population. So there's a kind of sanctioned violence which is in those books that, and this wasn't sanctioned violence. So I was interested to kind of put it back into the narrative.
Because there's this extraordinary sense of like that, but for the grace of God or whoever, one's family's experiences against another family experience very, very different.
Yeah.
And history fascinates you. Throughout your career, you seem to have been writing about history, victims of male brutality in the English Civil War. You had a poem about it, the aviator Lillian Bland.
Lillian Bland,
So
my hero. Yeah.
So how has that sustained your writing, this interest in history?
So I just think history, history is fascinating. It's a story of where we get to where we are, and history is as fascinating for what it leaves out as for what it includes. And I think I'm open to inspiration coming at me from all different kinds of places, but history has always been a fascination. And I think you know, the kind of challenge of history to us now in the present is a challenge of the imagination. And I think all history in a sense is an act of the imagination. So I like that kind of intervention between poetry and the eternal mystery of what happened in a recreation of a story about what might have been.
It's funny, this morning we were talking about speculative fiction, Peter and me, and we were talking about the series For All Mankind, which reimagines the space race as if the Russians had won.
Yeah.
And then the Americans decide to put women on the moon a lot sooner. And I was sort of wondering whether now in this age where we have fake news and nobody actually really remembers what happened, you know, is it about imagining alternative versions, and how do you ensure that the real version still exists?
Yes.
Or will there ever be a real version because it was told by, history was told by the winners and all that stuff?
All of that. Well, there are always going to be gaps and omissions, but I do think it's very important to try and hold, you know, what happened kind of firm and fast as much as we can know. We have a responsibility to the past as well. I think there is a potential pitfall of exploiting the past for our own purposes, and there is something kind of ethically questionable about that as well. So, you know, it's sort of, it's a balance between, you know, yes, this is something I can go into and explore, but also with a kind of respect and knowing the boundaries of what you can and cannot say appropriately about a particular thing.
When we were talking with Nick Laird a little earlier about just the act of commission, because this is what this little series is about. So when you're commissioned, how do you approach that? Is there something that you've been thinking about that fits into a commission, or?
Well, it depends. This commission happened to be very open. And so that's what happened for me in this instance. You know, I had these ideas, I had these disparate ideas, you know, the Laura Ingalls Wilder and the Benders, and then this kind of wagon trail story, but they hadn't quite, you know, coalesced until you get that kind of urge or impetus to do it. Other ones come at you really left of field and are more specific, and those are the ones I think that can either fail or succeed beyond your wildest expectations in a way, because it's a prompt to do something that you wouldn't otherwise have done. If you're very lucky, you'll end up with something that you wouldn't otherwise have done, but it is quite easy for that not to just click with, you know, with your sensibility, I suppose.
Well, it's been fantastic to just get a little background. I could talk to you for hours, but we don't have time. So thank you so much for giving us some insight into the creation of that amazing poem.
Thank you, Nessa.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So that's it for our special Attic Session episode on Acts of Commission. Quotidian's Acts of Commission project and these interviews have been supported by the Arts Council of Northern Ireland, Poetry Ireland and the Centre Culturel Irlandais. We're also grateful to Croke Park Hotel for their support, and we are delighted to be included in the 60th Belfast International Arts Festival. So thank you for watching Acts of Commission at the Attic Sessions.
I dream, 'cause it's the closest I'll ever get to you.